Hey guys, this video is going to be a bit nostalgic. 2 years ago, almost to the day, I made my first video on objective morality. It was in response to a YouTuber named Thunderfoot. Well, it turns out that another YouTuber has recently made a video where he makes almost the exact same claims and actually uses some of the same analogies. Anyway, I think this is worth going over again, and for those of you who've been following me for a while, maybe you'll get to see how some of my points have evolved. Anyway, let's start off this video staying true to form and knock out some definitions. I'll also put the premises to the moral argument in the more info section if anybody wants a quick refresher. The moral argument deals with objective morality, which simply means that right and wrong, also known as what we should or shouldn't do, is independent of our personal preferences. That being said, sometimes our preferences are consistent with what is moral, and sometimes they're not. For example, in some instances, maximizing our pleasure requires us to behave selflessly, and in other circumstances, it could require us to behave selfishly. What I'm saying is that if we came to the conclusion that objective morality did not exist, then we would still have incentives to behave in ways we once called moral. Nothing about the moral argument says that atheists cannot behave morally. It only says that atheists cannot account for the existence of objective morality. So let's take a look at a clip from his video. In this clip, a Christian presents the moral argument, and he critiques it with text on the screen. I gotta warn you, it's a bit dramatic, but here goes.
On atheism, it's hard to see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively binding. On the naturalistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. But if God does not exist, that is, atheism is true, then there is no basis for the affirmation of objective moral values, and there is no ground for objective moral duties, because there is no moral lawgiver, and there is no freedom of will. The less moral framework is atheism. Atheism has no grounds for objective moral values or duties.
The claim atheists cannot account for the existence of objective morality and the claim there is no morality without God are not equivalent. So rather than discovering a lie, you're merely misrepresenting your opponent's argument. Now, since objective morality means what we should or shouldn't do regardless of our personal preferences, then listing off these preferences, as you do in your video, doesn't help you account for the existence of objective morality. Now, I would be the first to agree that atheists can behave morally. I've even made a video about this, which I'll link to down below if you're interested. But nothing about that observation contradicts the moral argument, as you seem to think.
If you are a completely corrupt and amoral creature, if you can think of no reason at all to be good to anyone or anything, except for the arbitrary dictates of a tyrant and threats of torture if you do not comply with these dictates, you are probably a Christian.
Here you are projecting your mistakes on us. Nobody is arguing that objective morality is based on threats or arbitrary commands. Whether or not threats are present is completely irrelevant, because subjective desires don't account for the existence of objective morality. It wouldn't explain the existence of objective morality if we did it, and it doesn't account for the existence of objective morality when you do it. Now, you did bring up some interesting points about animals, and I do want to take a minute to talk about that. In your video, you show a clip of one turtle helping another turtle turn over. And to be fair, you probably could have just as easily found a clip of one turtle raping another. It's possible that turtles have knowledge of objective morality, but it's much more likely that they don't contemplate their moral duties. It appears from the outside that they just act in accordance with the self-interest of their genes, cooperating or using each other when it suits them. We can only observe what turtles actually do, not if they have knowledge about what they morally should do. However, if turtles, or perhaps more likely other creatures, do have knowledge of objective morality, then that doesn't help your case, and it certainly doesn't hurt mine. That wouldn't suggest that objective morality can exist outside of God. It would just be an additional reason to think that objective morality does indeed exist. So it would only support the second premise of the moral argument, which claims objective morality exists. Now, this next claim he makes kind of bugs me. Let's take a look. I'll play his voice, and then I'll use clips from a different video. You guys will see why.
And even though you, as a species like the piranha, might be incredibly dangerous and rip other things to shreds, you wouldn't bite each other.
Ever since Thunderfoot made that video on objective morality, I've seen that example crop up in at least 4 different people's videos. I mean, the point they're trying to make is simple, and it doesn't contradict the moral argument as they seem to think, But it is true that even if objective morality didn't exist, then we wouldn't become cannibals and we wouldn't start killing our best friends. However, as the video showed, piranhas are often cannibalistic, and they're a terrible species to use in order to make that point. So I really don't understand why so many people keep doing that. Anyway, let's get to the crux of the problem.
They say that without gods, you can have some kind of morality, but you can't have any objective morality. But they utterly fail in this attempt. Because whenever a Christian or any other theist describes what they call objective morality, it's patently obvious that what they're describing is neither objective nor moral. And what we get from theists who describe objective morality is anything but that. The morality of a theist is not objective in that it is entirely dependent on the arbitrary preferences of their own invisible imaginary friend.
So there's the problem. Now this may come as a surprise to some people, but when we use the term objective, what we really mean to say is objective. Now I've made a video called Objective and Subjective Defined where I really set the goalpost down clearly, and I'll put a link down below if anyone's interested. The position that you just described, where morality is dependent upon the arbitrary preferences of a god, is called voluntarism. Now the person you claim to be refuting is not a voluntarist. I am not a voluntarist, and in fact almost nobody is a voluntarist, because even among divine command theorists, voluntarism is a minority position. So what you've done here is critique the minority position and then dismiss the claims made by the majority.
It is not moral in that it is utterly unconcerned with whether or not anything is good or bad, but is purely concerned with whether or not actions offend or please this imaginary friend.
So, there's another mistake there, but it seems to be a smaller one. It's true that if God's nature is the standard of objective morality, then he would find moral actions to be pleasing. So God's pleasure and morality would be correlated. But you seem to be mixing up correlation and causation, which to be fair is a really common mistake. So for those who want to know the difference between those two things, I'll put a link in the more info section to a video on that topic as well. So here's a quick recap of the moral argument. Now, this is just going to be a quick summary, but there are additional arguments that can be used to support each premise. So here goes. We recognize that objective morality exists. That informs us that a standard of objective morality must exist and clues us in as to what properties that standard must have. Premise 1 of the moral argument shows us that if God does not exist, then objective morality would not exist. So that helps us to know not only that a God exists, but shows us what properties that deity must have.
If your God did exist, you would spend your time showing me the abundant evidence that your God existed, instead of wasting my time with emotional arguments and scare tactics, telling me how horrible it would be if your God did not exist.
At no point does either premise of the moral argument depend on how horrible it would be if God did not exist. If you've taken any logic courses, you would see that it's a straightforward attempt to prove God's existence. The moral argument is a deductive argument, and it is in valid form. What that means is that if you can show that both of the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Evidence for the premises is evidence for the conclusion. As always, test everything, hold on to the good.